I'll never forget the sound of my own screaming echoing through the marble halls of that godforsaken mansion. My daughter Chloe, my 7-year-old baby girl, lay motionless on the silk sheets, her face swollen beyond recognition, bruises blooming across her pale skin like poisonous flowers. Blood stained the pillow beneath her head. A decorative cushion with crimson smears had been thrown carelessly on the floor. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely pull out my phone to dial 911, and that's when I heard it. My stepmother Eleanor's voice, cold as winter steel, cutting through my panic like a knife. Well, now she finally looks like she matches her father's bloodline. Disposable trash. Before we go any further, if this story resonates with you or you know someone who needs to hear it, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your support means everything and helps us reach more people who need these stories. Let me take you back to how it all started, because the horror of that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of poison disguised as family love. My name is Ava Davenport, or at least that used to be my name before I reclaimed my identity and everything it represented. I was the daughter of Richard Davenport, a real estate mogul whose empire stretched across the eastern seaboard like a spider's web, with a particular stranglehold on New York's most exclusive neighborhoods. His name appeared in Forbes lists and business journals, always accompanied by words like ruthless visionary and uncompromising. My mother died when I was 12, a gentle woman with sad eyes who had somehow survived 20 years, married to a man whose heart was made of granite and whose soul was measured in dollar signs and property deeds. I remember finding her sometimes sitting alone in the sunroom of our Hamptons estate, staring out at the ocean with tears running silently down her face. When I asked what was wrong, she'd always smile and say she was fine, just tired. I understand now what she meant. Living with Richard Davenport was exhausting in a way that hollowed you out from the inside. The funeral was an elaborate affair, exactly the kind of ostentatious display my mother would have hated. 300 guests, many of whom had never spoken to her in life, came to pay their respects and network with my father. Richard stood by the casket, looking appropriately somber, shaking hands and accepting condolences with the practiced ease of a man who'd mastered every social transaction. He didn't cry, not once, not even when they lowered her into the ground. Ethan, my older brother by 4 years, stood beside him like a smaller, younger copy, already learning to wear the same mask of controlled indifference. I was 12 years old and completely shattered, but no one seemed to notice or care. The family friends who patted my head and told me I'd be okay didn't stick around to see if that was true. By the time the last guest left the reception, I felt like a ghost in my own home, invisible and irrelevant. Richard retreated to his study with a glass of whiskey and his business associates. Ethan went to his room to play video games, and I sat alone in my mother's sunroom, the place where she'd cried those silent tears, and wondered if anyone would ever see me the way she had. 6 months later, Richard announced he was getting remarried. He called Ethan and me into his study, that imposing room with dark wood paneling and leather furniture that smelled like cigars and old money. Eleanor was there, perched on the edge of his desk like she already owned the place. She was 37 to his 52, beautiful in the way that comes from expensive salons and personal trainers and cosmetic procedures that are never quite discussed. Her smile was warm and welcoming, but her eyes were calculating, taking inventory of everything in the room, including me and Ethan. Boys and girls, Richard said, though I was the only girl and felt the sting of being lumped in as an afterthought. Eleanor and I are going to be married next month. I expect you both to welcome her into this family and treat her with the respect she deserves as my wife. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Ethan, who was 16 and already learning to read the room, immediately stood up and shook Eleanor's hand, told her he was happy for them both. I sat frozen in my chair, looking at this stranger who was going to replace my mother before we'd even had time to properly grieve her. Eleanor's eyes met mine, and for just a second the warm smile slipped and I saw something cold underneath. Then it was back, the mask firmly in place. "I know this must be hard for you, Ava," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Losing your mother so young. But I want you to know I'm here for you. We're going to be a family." I spent my teenage years learning exactly what Eleanor meant by family. She made it clear from day one that I was a reminder of the previous Mrs. Davenport, an inconvenient leftover she had to tolerate until I was old enough to ship off to college. My mother's photographs disappeared from the common areas of the house, replaced by modern art that Eleanor selected. My mother's garden, which she'd tended lovingly for years, was ripped out and replaced with a minimalist stone design that required no maintenance and had no soul. When I protested, Eleanor smiled that sharp smile and said, "We're moving forward, darling. Living in the past isn't healthy." Ethan became her golden child almost immediately. She recognized in him the same calculating ambition that drove her, and she cultivated it carefully. By the time he graduated high school, he was the heir apparent to the Davenport fortune, completely aligned with Richard and Eleanor's vision for the family legacy. He'd learned that life was easier when you sided with Eleanor, that loyalty to his little sister was a luxury he couldn't afford if he wanted to maintain his position. I watched him transform from the brother who'd once defended me on the playground to a stranger who walked past me in our own home without acknowledgement. I survived by making myself small and invisible. I learned to move through the house like a shadow to keep my room meticulously clean, so Eleanor couldn't criticize to eat dinner in silence while they discussed business and society events I wasn't included in. I focused on school, dreaming of the day I'd turn 18 and escape to college, to anywhere that wasn't under their roof. The moment I turned 18, everything changed in ways I never expected. I met Daniel at a college party during freshman orientation week. I'd gone reluctantly, dragged along by my roommate, who was determined to help me break out of my shell. The party was loud and crowded, everything I usually avoided. But then I saw him across the room. He was standing by himself near the bookshelf, actually reading the spines of the books, while everyone else was drinking and dancing. When he caught me looking, he smiled, and it was the most genuine smile I'd seen in years. Daniel Martinez was a computer science major, brilliant and kind, with warm brown eyes that actually saw me as a person rather than a disappointing investment or a social stepping stone. He was first-generation college student. His parents had immigrated from Mexico and ran a small restaurant in Brooklyn. He'd earned his scholarship through sheer intelligence and determination, staying up late nights through high school to code and study while helping his parents with the restaurant. He had no money, no connections, no idea about the world I came from. And that made him absolutely perfect. We fell in love fast and hard, the way young people do when they're desperate to build something real in a world that feels increasingly fake. He'd never heard of the Davenport name and didn't care about my family's money. He liked me for the books I read, the way I laughed at his terrible jokes, my dreams of becoming a social worker, and helping people who'd been forgotten by the system. For the first time in my life since my mother died, someone saw me and valued me for who I actually was. When I got pregnant with Chloe during my sophomore year, I was terrified. We were both only 19, barely adults ourselves, still figuring out how to navigate college and life. But Daniel's response was immediate and unwavering. He proposed that same night, sitting on the floor of my dorm room, holding my hands while I cried. He didn't have a ring or some elaborate plan. He just looked at me with those warm eyes and said, "I love you and I love our baby already. We can do this together. Marry me." I said yes without hesitation. Whatever fear I had about being a young parent was nothing compared to the certainty that Daniel was good and real and would never abandon us the way my father had abandoned me emotionally years ago. Richard's reaction was exactly what I expected, but it still cut deeper than I prepared for. He summoned me to the Hamptons estate on a cold November Saturday, and I knew from his tone on the phone that this wasn't going to be a congratulatory visit. I drove out alone, my stomach in knots, 3 months pregnant and exhausted from morning sickness. He made me wait in the marble foyer for 20 minutes before calling me into his study, a power move I recognized even then. When I finally entered, he was sitting behind his massive desk, Eleanor standing beside him like a sharp-dressed sentinel. They looked like judges preparing to deliver a sentence. Richard didn't waste time on pleasantries. He called me into his study at the Hamptons estate, that massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, and delivered his verdict with the same tone he used to fire incompetent employees. "You've made your choice, Ava. That man is beneath this family's standards. His people run a restaurant, for God's sake. He has no pedigree, no connections, no prospects beyond some middle-class technical job. If you marry him, you're no longer a Davenport in anything but name. Don't expect a penny from me. Not for the wedding, not for the baby, not for anything. You'll be completely cut off." Eleanor stood beside him, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his shoulder, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car, and she looked at my growing belly like it was something distasteful she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Some people are just destined for mediocrity, Richard. At least now it's official. She'll be changing diapers in some cramped apartment in Queens while her brother builds empires. It's almost poetic, really. I should have been devastated, but instead I felt something like relief wash over me. The last thread connecting me to my father. The small, desperate hope that he might love me if I was good enough, pretty enough, successful enough, finally snapped. I looked at him sitting there in his $1,000 suit, surrounded by his wealth and power, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was empty. All that money and success, and he couldn't manage the basic human capacity to love his own daughter or welcome his first grandchild. That was his failure, not mine. I don't want your money, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And I don't want Chloe growing up thinking she needs to earn love by meeting impossible standards. Keep your fortune, Dad. I'd rather raise my daughter poor and loved than rich and miserable like I was here. I walked out before he could respond, and I didn't look back. It felt like shedding a weight I'd been carrying my entire life. I married Daniel anyway 3 weeks later. We had Chloe in a small ceremony at City Hall with his parents and a few close friends. No one from my side of the family attended, but I barely noticed. Daniel's mother, Rosa, cried happy tears and hugged me like I was her own daughter. His father, Miguel, shook Daniel's hand and told him he was proud of him. These people who barely knew me welcomed me into their family without conditions or judgment. This was what family was supposed to feel like. For 3 years, we built a life together. Daniel worked his way up at a tech startup while finishing his degree at night, often studying after long days of coding and debugging. I took online classes toward my social work degree and worked part-time at a small independent bookstore in our neighborhood, bringing Chloe with me when the owner didn't mind. We raised our daughter in a tiny apartment in Queens that had more love in its cramped rooms than the Davenport mansion ever held. The apartment was 500 square feet, with radiators that clanked in winter, and no air conditioning in summer, but it was ours. We painted the walls ourselves, bought furniture from thrift stores, and created a home that felt safe and warm. But Daniel and I, we were young and stressed and exhausted. Being parents at 19 and 20 was harder than either of us had imagined. The fight started small, usually about money and how we never seemed to have enough of it. About whose turn it was to wake up with Chloe at 3 in the morning when she had nightmares or was sick. About the dreams we'd put on hold. The college experiences we'd missed. The friends who drifted away because they were still living carefree lives while we were dealing with toddler tantrums and mounting bills. The love was still there, buried under the weight of responsibility and resentment, but we couldn't find our way back to it. We were drowning in the daily grind of survival and forgetting why we jumped into the water together in the first place. When Chloe was 3, after another fight about money where we both said things we didn't mean and couldn't take back, we made the painful decision to divorce. It was amicable enough, no screaming matches or bitter custody battles. We both still cared about each other, we were just too young and too tired to keep trying. We agreed on joint custody, and Daniel moved into an apartment 10 blocks away so Chloe could easily go between our homes. We promised each other we'd put her first, that we wouldn't let our failed marriage hurt her. That's when Richard reached out. After 4 years of complete silence, not even a card. When Chloe was born, I got a phone call from my father on a random Tuesday evening. His voice on the line was neutral and measured, revealing nothing. I heard about the divorce, he said, like we'd been in regular contact instead of being strangers. Perhaps it's time we reconnected. Chloe is still my granddaughter after all. She shouldn't suffer because of past disagreements between us. I may have been harsh before, but blood is blood. Family is important. I should have known better. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap, that Richard Davenport never did anything without a calculated reason. But I was 25 years old, newly divorced, lonely, and broke, and so desperately tired of struggling alone. The bookstore had cut my hours due to slow sales, rent was going up, and I was behind on Chloe's preschool payments. My student loan bills were piling up, and I'd had to choose between fixing my car's broken transmission or buying Chloe new shoes because she'd outgrown her old ones. I was barely holding everything together, and I was terrified of failing my daughter. When Richard offered to help with expenses and invited us to family events when he spoke about wanting to know his granddaughter and make up for lost time, I wanted so badly to believe he'd changed. Maybe becoming a grandfather had softened him. Maybe losing me for 4 years had made him realize what mattered. Maybe Eleanor had encouraged him to build bridges. I know how naive that sounds now, but desperation makes you believe things you know aren't true. The first few months were almost pleasant. Richard paid off my debts and set up a small monthly allowance. Eleanor was civil at Sunday dinners, though I caught her examining Chloe with the kind of cold assessment you'd give a used car you were considering purchasing. My daughter was beautiful and bright, with Daniel's warm brown eyes and my mother's gentle smile, but Eleanor could only see what she wasn't. She wasn't Isabel, Ethan, and Victoria's daughter who wore designer clothes and attended the most expensive private school in Manhattan. Ethan had married Victoria Chen 3 years ago, a union that thrilled Richard and Eleanor because Victoria's family owned a shipping empire based in Hong Kong. Their daughter Isabel was everything they'd ever wanted. A pure pedigree child born into the right circumstances, groomed from birth to represent the Davenport legacy. The comparison started subtly. Oh, Chloe prefers chicken nuggets. How simple. Isabel only eats organic, of course. Or, Chloe's preschool seems nice for what it is. Isabel attends Montessori naturally. Each comment was delivered with a smile that didn't reach Eleanor's eyes calibrated to wound, without providing grounds for confrontation. I bit my tongue and accepted it because Richard's money meant Chloe had health insurance, and I could finally afford to fix our apartment's broken heating. I told myself I was being smart and practical, that I was protecting my daughter's future by maintaining this connection. Really, I was trading my dignity and Chloe's well-being for financial survival, and somewhere deep down, I knew it. The real warning signs started about 6 months before that terrible night. Eleanor began making increasingly pointed remarks about Chloe's appearance and behavior. She's quite thin, isn't she? Are you feeding her properly, Ava? Or does she always fidget so much? Isabel has such lovely manners. The words were poison wrapped in concern, designed to make me doubt myself as a mother. Richard was different, but equally disturbing. He'd watch Chloe with this cold, calculating expression, as if she were a stock he was considering whether to buy or sell. At a 4th of July barbecue at the Hamptons' house, I overheard him talking to his lawyer Sterling, a shark of a man with silver hair and dead eyes. Bloodlines matter in this business, Sterling. Reputation, legacy, the right connections. You can't build an empire on compromised foundations. I didn't understand it then, or maybe I didn't want to. I just kept showing up to family dinners, kept accepting the checks, kept letting Chloe spend time with grandparents, who looked at her like she was something that needed to be fixed or removed. Then came the invitation to Isabel's 7th birthday party. It was going to be the event of the season, Eleanor assured me over the phone. 200 guests at the Hamptons estate, a live band, custom decorations imported from France, a cake that cost more than I paid in monthly rent. Of course you and Chloe must attend, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false warmth. Family is so important after all. I almost said no. The night before the party, Chloe was exhausted from a busy week at her summer program, and I could feel something wrong in my bones, a mother's instinct screaming danger. But Richard called personally, his tone brooking no argument. Ava, your presence is expected. This is about Isabel, not your petty discomforts. Chloe needs to know her family. So we went. I dressed Chloe in the nicest dress we owned, a simple blue cotton thing from Target that I'd bought on sale. I wore a sundress from my college days that was clean, but obviously inexpensive. When we arrived at the mansion, my stomach dropped. Every other guest was dripping in designer labels and jewelry that cost more than cars. The women's dresses probably cost thousands of dollars each, and their children looked like they'd walked out of luxury fashion spreads. Eleanor greeted us at the door with a smile that made my skin crawl. She was wearing a Chanel suit in cream, her hair perfectly coiffed, diamonds glittering at her throat. Her eyes swept over me and Chloe with barely concealed disgust. Oh, Ava, she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to hear. You've certainly maintained your simple aesthetic, haven't you? How charmingly humble. And Chloe, darling, you look so thin. Are you sure she's being properly cared for? Several women in the entrance hall turned to look, their expressions ranging from pity to judgment. I felt my face burn with humiliation, but I forced a smile and took Chloe's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. My daughter looked up at me with confused eyes, not understanding why grandmother's words felt like slaps. The party was torture. Eleanor positioned Chloe on the absolute periphery of every activity, making sure she was always slightly excluded, always just outside the circle of privileged children who belonged there. When it came time to cut the cake, there was a photo opportunity. Eleanor very deliberately maneuvered Chloe away from the family group, gently, but firmly pushing her to the side, while pulling Isabel front and center. I saw it happen, watched my daughter's face fall, as she realized she wasn't wanted in the picture, but I said nothing. I just stood there like a coward, afraid to cause a scene. By 8 o'clock, Chloe was exhausted. She tugged on my sleeve, her little face pale with fatigue. "Mommy, I'm tired. Can we please go home?" I nodded and led her upstairs to one of the guest rooms, the same room I'd slept in as a child. I tucked her into the massive bed, kissed her forehead, and promised I'd be back in just a few minutes. I needed to find Richard and Eleanor to say goodbye, and thank them for the invitation the polite ritual expected of me. I came back downstairs and moved through the crowd of networking elites searching for my father. I found him in the library surrounded by several of his most important business associates, men who controlled real estate developments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They all held expensive whiskey in crystal glasses, laughing at some private joke. I was about to interrupt when Richard raised his glass and made a toast. His words stopped me cold. "Gentlemen to legacy and bloodlines. In business as in life, we must be willing to prune the weak branches to let the strong ones flourish. Only what's pure deserves to remain part of the tree." He glanced directly at me as he said it, his eyes cold and purposeful. The other men nodded in agreement, though they probably thought he was making some metaphorical point about business strategy. But I understood. I saw Eleanor standing in the doorway across the room, watching me, a small, satisfied smile playing at her lips. "Soon enough," Eleanor said to no one in particular, but loud enough for me to hear, "everything will be exactly as it should be. The impure elements removed, the legacy restored." The words hit me like ice water. Every maternal instinct I possessed suddenly screamed in alarm. I didn't stop to think or question or rationalize. I just turned and ran. I pushed through the crowd of guests, my heart hammering in my chest, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Please let her be okay, please let her be okay, please let her be okay. I threw open the door to the guest room and my world exploded into nightmare. Chloe lay motionless on the bed, her face swollen and bruised, a dark purple spreading across her cheekbone and temple. Blood matted her blonde hair and stained the white pillowcase beneath her head. One of the decorative cushions from the chaise lounge had been thrown on the floor, smeared with blood. The scream that tore from my throat didn't sound human. I lunged toward my daughter, scooping her into my arms. Her body was warm but limp, her breathing shallow and irregular. Blood trickled from her nose and the corner of her mouth. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I tried to dial 911. That's when they appeared in the doorway, Richard and Eleanor. They didn't look shocked or horrified. They looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something important by making a fuss, like my daughter's broken body was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. "What did you do?" I screamed at them, my voice raw and desperate. "What did you do to my baby?" Eleanor's response was delivered in a voice so cold it could have frozen blood. "Well, now she finally looks like she matches her father's bloodline. Disposable trash." The words were so monstrous, so utterly inhuman, that for a moment I couldn't process them. My brain refused to accept that anyone could say something like that about an injured child, about their own granddaughter. Richard stepped forward, but not to help. He reached for my phone as I was trying to dial emergency services. "Don't be dramatic, Ava. You'll destroy the family's reputation. Think about what you're doing." His hand closed around my wrist, trying to pry the phone away. In that moment, I saw him clearly for the first time in my life. Not as my father, not as someone who could love or feel or care, but as a monster wearing human skin. A man so consumed by his vision of legacy and purity that he could orchestrate or allow the brutalization of a 7-year-old child. Something primal took over. I bit down hard on Richard's hand, tasting blood, and shoved him backward with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Get away from us, you fucking monsters," I screamed. "Get away from my daughter." I ran past them, Chloe's limp body in my arms, her blood soaking into my dress. I flew down the stairs past Ethan and Victoria, who stood frozen in the foyer, their faces pale with shock. I burst through the front door into the night air, and that's when I saw the flashing lights. An ambulance and 2 police cars were pulling into the circular driveway. Daniel was there, running toward me, his face twisted in panic and fear. Later I learned that he'd called 911. He'd been planning to pick us up early, had called me around 7:30, and heard something in my voice that worried him. When I didn't answer his follow-up calls, his instincts told him something was terribly wrong. He drove to the Hamptons and arrived just in time to see me running from the house with our daughter bleeding in my arms. The paramedics took Chloe from me, working on her with urgent efficiency as they loaded her into the ambulance. I climbed in beside her, holding her small hand, whispering prayers I didn't really believe in. Daniel followed in his car, and I watched through the ambulance window as police officers began questioning Richard and Eleanor at the mansion entrance. At the hospital, time became meaningless. Doctors rushed Chloe into emergency surgery. The injuries were severe. A fractured skull, bleeding in the brain, bruised ribs. Internal bruising consistent with sustained blunt force trauma. The doctor who explained it to me had tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Davenport, someone beat your daughter severely. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate and brutal." I collapsed in the waiting room, and Daniel held me as I shattered into a million pieces. We sat there for hours while surgeons fought to save our daughter's life, to prevent permanent brain damage, to piece together her small broken body. Richard and Eleanor arrived at the hospital within an hour, flanked by their lawyer Sterling. The man moved like a predator, already spinning the narrative before the facts could speak for themselves. I heard him talking to the police in hushed tones, feeding them a story about a tragic accident, about Chloe falling down the stairs, about me being emotionally unstable after my divorce, about my history of depression and possible neglect. I wanted to scream, to attack him, to tear apart every lie with my bare hands. But I was numb with shock and terror, unable to do anything but wait for news about Chloe. Detective James Harding was the one who saved us. He was a 20-year veteran of the force, a broad-shouldered black man with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen too much cruelty in the world. While other officers seemed intimidated by the Davenport name and money, Detective Harding looked at Richard and Eleanor with the same cold assessment he'd give any suspects. He pulled me aside in a private conference room. "Mrs. Davenport, I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight," he said gently. "Everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So I told him. Every detail, every warning sign I'd ignored, every cruel comment, every moment of cold calculation I'd witnessed. I told him about Richard's toast, about Eleanor's smile, about finding Chloe broken and bleeding while they stood in the doorway looking annoyed rather than horrified. Detective Harding listened to everything, taking careful notes. When I finished, he looked me straight in the eye. "I want you to know something. I don't care how much money your father has, or how many politicians he knows. If he hurt that little girl, I'll make sure he pays for it. That's a promise." It was the first moment of hope I'd felt in hours. Someone believed me. Someone with power was willing to stand up to Richard Davenport. Chloe survived the surgery, but the doctors couldn't promise she'd ever fully recover. The brain injury was severe. She'd need extensive rehabilitation therapy, possibly multiple additional surgeries. The next 72 hours would be critical in determining what kind of life she'd have if she woke up. I stayed by her bedside, holding her small hand, watching the monitors track her vital signs. Daniel brought me coffee, and food I couldn't eat sat with me in silence, because there were no words adequate for this horror. Meanwhile, the Davenport machine went into full attack mode. Within 24 hours of Chloe's hospitalization, stories began appearing in the press. Anonymous sources claimed I was an unstable mother with a history of mental illness. There were suggestions that I'd been negligent, that I'd been drinking at the party, that my divorce had left me emotionally fragile and possibly dangerous. Photos of me looking haggard and wild-eyed were splashed across tabloid websites alongside carefully curated images of Richard and Eleanor looking distinguished and concerned. Sterling filed an emergency petition for custody of Chloe, claiming I was an unfit mother who posed a danger to my own child. The petition was filled with distortions and outright lies, but it was written on expensive letterhead and backed by an army of lawyers who knew exactly how to work the system. My apartment was broken into and trashed. Someone spray-painted "child abuser" on my building's front door. I received dozens of threatening phone calls from blocked numbers. Richard's people were trying to intimidate me into silence, to make me too afraid and broken to fight back. But they'd miscalculated. They thought I was still the scared, compliant daughter who'd spent her life seeking their approval. They didn't understand that the moment I saw my daughter's broken body, something in me had crystallized into pure diamond-hard determination. They could destroy my reputation, vandalize my home, threaten me all they wanted. I would not stop until they paid for what they'd done to Chloe. Daniel became my rock during those dark days. He used his skills as a programmer to help me in ways I never could have managed alone. He discovered that my phone had been hacked weeks before the party, likely by someone Richard had hired. And in recovering data from my phone's backup, Daniel found something crucial: a voice recording that had been automatically captured during the party. The recording was from when I'd gone back downstairs before finding Chloe. It had captured Richard's toast about pruning weak branches about purity and legacy. It had captured Eleanor's follow-up comment about impure elements being removed. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to establish their state of mind and intentions. Detective Harding was relentless in his investigation. He interviewed every staff member who'd worked the party, and one of them, a young server named Maria, came forward with crucial testimony. She'd seen Eleanor go upstairs about 20 minutes before I found Chloe. Maria had heard sounds of a struggle and a child crying, but she'd been too afraid of losing her job to investigate. The guilt was eating her alive, and she broke down in tears as she gave her statement. Harding also dug into Richard's past, uncovering a pattern of ruthless behavior that bordered on criminal. Business partners who'd crossed him had faced mysterious audits and destroyed reputations. A whistleblower at one of his companies had been found dead in an apparent suicide, though the circumstances were suspicious. Richard Davenport was a man who eliminated obstacles, and apparently his own granddaughter had become an obstacle to his vision of a pure family legacy. While all this was happening, Chloe remained in a coma. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. I read to her, sang to her, told her stories about all the things we'd do when she woke up. The doctors couldn't tell me if she'd ever open her eyes again, if she'd ever be the bright, laughing little girl she'd been before that night. Ethan visited once, looking haunted and destroyed. He stood in the doorway of Chloe's hospital room, staring at his niece connected to machines tubes, helping her breathe and feeding her through an IV. I heard them, he finally whispered. After you ran downstairs with Chloe, Mother said to Father, now there's only Isabel, just as it should be. She was smiling, Ava. She was smiling. He left before I could respond, but that conversation marked the beginning of his crisis of conscience. Victoria had been furious when the truth started coming out, appalled that her daughter had been raised alongside such monsters. She was already consulting divorce lawyers and making plans to take Isabel far away from the Davenport toxicity. The case went to trial 4 months after that terrible night. Sterling pulled out every trick in his arsenal, trying to paint me as an unhinged woman, making false accusations against her loving family. He suggested that Chloe's injuries could have been caused by a fall I'd failed to witness, that my mental state had led me to construct an elaborate conspiracy theory rather than face my own negligence. But Detective Harding's investigation had been thorough, and Daniel's recovered audio provided damning context. The prosecution presented a timeline showing Eleanor going upstairs shortly before I discovered Chloe, backed by Maria's testimony. They presented the audio recording of Richard's sinister toast and Eleanor's comment about removing impure elements. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about narcissistic personality disorder and the dehumanization of family members who didn't fit a desired image. The trial was a media circus. Every day brought new revelations about the Davenport family's darkness. Old business associates came forward with stories of Richard's cruelty. Former household staff described Eleanor's treatment of me when I was a child, the verbal abuse and calculated humiliation. The turning point came when Ethan took the stand as a witness for the prosecution. Victoria had left him by then, taking Isabel to Hong Kong to live with her family, and Ethan had nothing left to lose. He looked 20 years older than his age as he sat in the witness box, and when the prosecutor asked him what he'd heard his mother say after Chloe was found, he broke down completely. She said, "Now there's only Isabel, just as it should be," Ethan testified, his voice shaking. She said that half-breed trash had no place in the Davenport family anyway. And my father, he just nodded like she'd said something perfectly reasonable. Like my niece being beaten half to death was an acceptable solution to a problem. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order as reporters frantically typed on their phones and laptops. Eleanor's lawyer tried to discredit Ethan's testimony, suggesting he was lying out of spite, but the damage was done. Combined with all the other evidence, his testimony painted a picture of two people so consumed by their vision of genetic purity and family legacy that they'd committed or sanctioned an act of horrific violence. The final nail in the coffin came when Richard lost control on the witness stand. The prosecution had been methodically dismantling his carefully constructed persona, pressing him on his views about bloodlines and legacy, and what should happen to family members who didn't meet his standards. Finally, after hours of relentless questioning, he snapped. "That child is an embarrassment," he shouted, his face red with fury. "She represents everything weak and compromised in this family. She never should have existed. She's a stain on the Davenport name, and yes, she deserved to be put in her place." The courtroom went dead silent. Eleanor actually fainted, though whether from genuine shock or theatrical instinct was unclear. Richard's lawyer looked like he wanted to die on the spot, and I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. They'd finally shown their true faces to the world. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Richard and Eleanor Davenport were found guilty of conspiracy to commit assault, child abuse, and obstruction of justice. The judge, a grandmother herself, showed no mercy at sentencing. Richard received 15 years. Eleanor received 12. Both were also convicted in a subsequent civil trial, ordered to pay damages that effectively bankrupted them. The Davenport empire crumbled almost overnight. Business partners fled from the association. Properties were seized to pay legal fees and judgments. The Hamptons mansion, that monument to their wealth and cruelty, was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. Every asset was liquidated to cover Chloe's medical expenses, ongoing therapy, and to fund a trust that would support her for the rest of her life. Ethan lost everything too. Victoria's divorce stripped him of access to her family's money, and his association with his parents made him untouchable in business circles. Last I heard, he was working as a manager at a mid-tier hotel chain, living in a studio apartment in New Jersey, carrying the weight of his complicity and cowardice like chains around his neck. Through all of this, Chloe remained in a coma. 5 months after that terrible night, I was reading her favorite book, The Secret Garden, when I felt her fingers twitch in my hand. I almost thought I'd imagined it, but then her eyelids fluttered. I called for the nurses, and within minutes her room was filled with doctors and specialists. She woke up slowly, confused and frightened, unable to remember what had happened to her. The brain damage had affected her motor skills and cognitive processing. She'd need years of therapy, and some effects might be permanent. But she was alive. She recognized me. And when I held her and told her I loved her, she whispered back, "Love you too, Mommy." The recovery was long and difficult. Chloe had to relearn how to walk properly, how to hold a pencil, how to read words that had once been easy for her. She had nightmares and anxiety attacks. But children are resilient in ways adults aren't, and slowly, painfully, she began to heal. I used part of the settlement money to move us to a small town in Vermont, far from the Davenport name and all its poisonous associations. We found a cozy house with a big backyard and neighbors who knew nothing about our past. I enrolled Chloe in a good school with a special education program, and we started building a life that had nothing to do with money or status or family legacy. Daniel remained a constant presence. We didn't get back together romantically. The damage from our failed marriage couldn't be undone, but we became genuine partners in parenting. He moved to Vermont too, got a job at a local tech company, and spent every other weekend with Chloe. The three of us learned how to be a different kind of family, one built on respect and cooperation rather than romantic love. I used the rest of the settlement to establish a nonprofit organization called Chloe's House, dedicated to helping victims of family abuse and violence. I hired staff, set up safe houses, created support programs. Every person we helped felt like a small redemption, a way to transform the horror we'd survived into something that could protect others. 1 year after the trial ended, on a bright September afternoon, Chloe and I were flying kites in a field near our new home. The sky was impossibly blue, and the wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and fresh-cut grass. Chloe was laughing as she ran with her kite, her movements still slightly uncoordinated, but growing stronger every day. The scars on her face had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. She ran back to me, breathless and glowing with joy, and threw her arms around my waist. "Mommy, you're my superhero," she said, looking up at me with those warm brown eyes she'd inherited from Daniel. "You saved me." I knelt down and held her close, feeling the solid warmth of her body against mine. This miracle child, who'd survived the unsurvivable. Tears ran down my face, but they were different tears than the ones I'd cried in that hospital room. These were tears of gratitude and relief and fierce protective love. "No, baby," I whispered into her hair. "We saved each other." I looked up at the impossibly blue sky, at the kite dancing in the wind, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Real, genuine peace. The kind that comes not from having everything you want, but from having fought for everything that matters and emerged on the other side intact. Richard and Eleanor Davenport had tried to destroy us because we didn't fit their sick vision of perfection. They'd seen my daughter as disposable trash, something to be eliminated in service of their legacy, but they'd forgotten something fundamental about the human spirit. When you push people to their absolute breaking point, when you threaten what they love most in the world, they don't always break. Sometimes they transform into something stronger than you ever imagined. I'm not the scared, compliant daughter anymore, desperate for scraps of approval from people who could never love me. I'm a mother who fought monsters and won. I'm a woman who looked at the very bottom of human cruelty and decided that wouldn't be the end of my story or my daughter's. Some people might say I should forgive, that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But I'm not holding on to anger. I'm holding on to justice. I'm holding on to the knowledge that evil actions have consequences, that monsters can be defeated, and that protecting the innocent is always worth whatever price you have to pay. My father and stepmother will spend the best years they have left in prison cells, stripped of everything they valued. Their precious legacy is ashes. Their name is synonymous with cruelty and child abuse. And somewhere in a field in Vermont, the granddaughter they tried to destroy is flying a kite and laughing, alive and healing and surrounded by people who genuinely love her. That's the best revenge I could ever ask for. That's what real legacy looks like. Here's what I learned through all of this. Family isn't defined by blood or money or prestigious last names. Family is defined by who shows up when things get dark, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, who sees your value even when the world tries to convince you you're worthless. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you were born into. If you're in a toxic relationship, whether it's with parents, siblings, a romantic partner, or anyone else, please hear me when I say this. You don't owe them your suffering. You don't owe them your silence. You don't owe them pieces of your soul just because they demand it. The moment someone shows you they value their image, their money, or their vision of how things should be more than they value your well-being or the well-being of someone you love, believe them. And get out before they can do irreparable damage. It took me too long to see the truth about Richard and Eleanor. I ignored warning signs because I was desperate for family connection and financial stability. I let my daughter into the orbit of monsters because I couldn't accept that my own father was incapable of love. That guilt will never fully leave me. But what I can do is use our story to warn others, to help them recognize the patterns earlier than I did, to give them the courage to walk away before it's too late. Standing in that field with Chloe, watching her chase her kite across the grass, I made a promise to myself and to her. We would never again sacrifice our peace, our safety, or our dignity for anyone's approval. We would build a life on our terms, surrounded by people who saw us as valuable human beings, rather than obstacles or disappointments. And you know what? That life is beautiful. It's not fancy or glamorous. There's no designer clothes or Hampton mansions or society parties. Just a small house in Vermont, a daughter who's learning to heal, a co-parent who respects me, meaningful work, helping others, and a sense of freedom I never had when I was trying to earn love from people who had none to give. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up hearing my own screams, seeing Chloe's broken body, feeling that moment of pure terror when I thought I'd lost her forever. But then I walk down the hall to her room and watch her sleep peacefully. Her chest rising and falling with each breath, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. And I know we made it through. We survived. The journey from that night to where we are now wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks and hard days and moments when I wondered if we'd ever truly be okay. About 8 months after Chloe woke up, she started having panic attacks whenever we encountered anyone who reminded her of Eleanor, an older woman with similar hair, a certain perfume. Even just a particular tone of voice could send her into spiraling terror. We worked with a trauma therapist who specialized in childhood PTSD, and slowly, session by session, Chloe learned tools to manage her anxiety. There were also moments of unexpected grace. A teacher at Chloe's new school, Mrs. Patterson, took special interest in her recovery. She'd stay after class to help Chloe with reading comprehension when the brain injury made processing difficult. She never treated Chloe like she was broken or different, just like a student who needed a little extra support. That kindness made more difference than any expensive therapy ever could. Daniel started dating someone about a year after we moved to Vermont. Her name was Sarah, a kindergarten teacher with a gentle soul and infinite patience. I was worried at first about how Chloe would react to another woman in her father's life, but Sarah was wonderful with her. She never tried to be a replacement mother, just a caring adult who showed up consistently and treated Chloe with genuine affection. Watching them together, seeing Chloe laugh at Sarah's silly jokes and ask her for help with art projects, I felt grateful that my daughter was learning what healthy adult relationships looked like. I started dating too tentatively, though it was harder for me. Trust didn't come easily anymore. The first man I went out with made an offhand comment about children needing discipline, and I ended the date immediately, my heart racing with old panic. But eventually I met Marcus, a social worker who understood trauma because he'd lived through his own. He never pushed, never demanded access to parts of me I wasn't ready to share. We took things slowly, and for the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be with someone who valued my boundaries, rather than seeing them as obstacles to overcome. The holidays were strange in our new life. That first Thanksgiving, it was just Chloe, Daniel, and me in our small kitchen, cooking a modest meal that bore no resemblance to the elaborate Davenport affairs I'd grown up with. No crystal chandeliers or hired servers or uncomfortable small talk with people who looked down on me. Just the three of us laughing as we burned the rolls, and Chloe insisted on making a centerpiece from leaves she'd collected in the yard. It was perfect in its simplicity. Christmas was harder. Chloe saw advertisements showing big happy families gathered around trees, and she asked questions I struggled to answer. Why don't we see Grandpa Richard and Grandma Eleanor anymore? Don't they miss me? The therapist had advised honesty appropriate to her age. So I told her that sometimes people make very bad choices that hurt others, and when that happens, we have to stay away from them to keep ourselves safe. She seemed to accept this, though I knew more difficult conversations would come. As she got older and understood more about what had really happened, the nonprofit work became my purpose and my healing. Every woman I helped escape an abusive situation, every child I placed in a safe environment, felt like I was rewriting the ending of our story over and over. I hired a small staff of people who understood trauma from the inside because they'd survived it themselves. We created programs for legal assistance therapy, job training, and temporary housing. Chloe's house became known throughout Vermont, and eventually in neighboring states as a place where people could go when they had nowhere else to turn. One of our clients was a woman named Jennifer, who'd escaped from her parents' cult-like religious compound with her 3 children. She'd been told her entire life that she was worthless, that questioning authority was sinful, that her only value lay in obedience and producing children for the compound. When she finally found the courage to run, she had nothing but the clothes on her back and 3 terrified kids. We gave her shelter, helped her find work, connected her with legal aid to establish custody and prevent her parents from taking the children back. 2 years later, she was thriving. Her kids were in good schools, she'd gotten her GED, and started community college, and she'd found a supportive church community that didn't use religion as a weapon. Jennifer sent me a letter on the 2nd anniversary of the day she'd walked into Chloe's house. "You saved our lives," she wrote, "but more than that, you showed me that I was worth saving, that my children deserved better than what I'd been taught to accept. You gave us permission to want more, to be more. Thank you for turning your pain into our hope." I kept that letter in my desk drawer and read it whenever I felt overwhelmed or wondered if any of this mattered. It did matter. Every single person we helped mattered. Ethan reached out about 18 months after the trial. He sent a letter to my lawyer asking if I'd be willing to meet with him. I almost said no immediately, but something made me pause. Curiosity, maybe, or the need for closure, or just the exhausted recognition that he'd been a victim of Richard and Eleanor too, even if he'd also been complicit in their cruelty. We met at a coffee shop halfway between his place and mine. He looked terrible, haunted, and thin, wearing a cheap jacket from a department store instead of the designer suits he'd lived in before. He didn't make excuses or try to justify what he'd done. He just apologized, his voice breaking multiple times, and told me he'd give anything to go back and make different choices. "I was a coward," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "I chose comfort and money over doing what was right. I stood by while they destroyed you, and I did nothing when they went after Chloe. I'll never forgive myself for that, and I don't expect you to forgive me either. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what they were, what I let myself become by association." I didn't forgive him, not really, but I did feel something like pity. Ethan had sold his soul for a lifestyle that turned out to be built on nothing but cruelty and lies, and now he'd lost everything. His wife, his daughter, his money, his future, all of it gone. He was living with the consequences of his choices, and they were destroying him from the inside out. "Isabel asks about Chloe sometimes," he said quietly. "Victoria lets me video call once a week. Isabel remembers her cousin and wants to know why we don't see her anymore. I don't know what to tell her." "Tell her the truth," I said. "Age appropriately, but the truth. Tell her that our family made terrible mistakes, and sometimes mistakes have consequences that last a long time. Tell her that you're trying to be better, trying to learn from what happened. And tell her that Chloe is safe and happy, and that's what matters most. We didn't become close after that meeting, but we stayed in occasional contact. Ethan was trying to rebuild his life from nothing, working long hours and going to therapy, slowly coming to terms with the man he'd been and the man he wanted to become. I didn't know if he'd succeed, but I could see he was trying, and that counted for something. Richard and Eleanor, on the other hand, showed no remorse whatsoever. From prison, they continued to maintain their innocence, claiming they'd been railroaded by an overzealous prosecutor and a vindictive daughter. Eleanor gave an interview to a true crime podcast where she painted herself as a victim of circumstance, a loving grandmother falsely accused by a mentally unstable woman. The podcast was universally panned for giving a platform to an unrepentant child abuser, but Eleanor seemed to genuinely believe her own narrative. Richard remained silent, refusing all interview requests, but his lawyer released statements maintaining his innocence and promising appeals. None of the appeals went anywhere. The evidence was too solid, the jury verdict too clear. He'd spend his time in prison, and there was no redemption arc coming for him. I didn't visit them, didn't write, didn't engage at all. They were dead to me in every way that mattered. Sometimes people asked if I'd ever consider reconciliation, if I thought forgiveness was important for my own healing. My answer was always the same. Forgiveness isn't about pretending horrible things didn't happen or welcoming abusers back into your life. Real healing comes from accepting the truth, protecting yourself and those you love, and building a future that doesn't include the people who tried to destroy you. Chloe asked about them sometimes, especially as she got older, and started piecing together fragments of memory and overheard conversations. On her 9th birthday, 2 years after that terrible night, she looked at me with those serious brown eyes and said, "They hurt me, didn't they, Grandpa Richard and Grandma Eleanor? That's why I was in the hospital." I'd been dreading this conversation, but I'd also been preparing for it with her therapist. I sat down with her and told her the truth in language she could understand. That yes, they had hurt her very badly. That they were sick people who had wrong ideas about what made someone valuable. That it wasn't her fault that she'd done nothing wrong and that she was safe now because we'd made sure they could never hurt her again. She cried, and I held her, and we grieved together for the family that should have been, but never was. And then she asked the question that broke my heart and put it back together all at once. "But you kept me safe, right, Mommy? You stopped them." "Yes, baby," I whispered. "I stopped them, and I'll keep you safe for the rest of my life. That's a promise." She nodded against my shoulder, and after a while, her tears stopped. "Can we have cake now?" she asked, and just like that, she was a 9-year-old at her birthday party again, resilient and healing and moving forward. The 3rd anniversary of that night arrived on a warm June evening. Chloe was doing well in school, despite ongoing challenges with processing speed and fine motor skills. She'd made friends, real friends, who liked her for who she was. She'd joined a community theater group and discovered a love for performing. Her therapist said she was making remarkable progress, that her ability to trust and form healthy attachments despite her trauma was testament to her strength and the support system we'd built around her. Daniel and Sarah had gotten engaged, and Chloe was thrilled to be a junior bridesmaid at their wedding. Marcus and I had moved in together, taking the next step in a relationship built on patience and mutual respect. He was wonderful with Chloe, never trying to replace Daniel, but offering his own brand of steady, dependable care. Chloe's house had expanded to 3 locations and had helped over 200 families in 3 years. We'd gotten grant funding from the state and donations from people across the country who'd heard our story. Every person we helped felt like vindication proof that something good could grow from even the darkest soil. That evening, the anniversary of the worst night of our lives, I took Chloe to the same field where we'd flown kites a year ago. This time, we brought wildflower seeds and planted them together, creating a memorial, not to the trauma, but to our survival. As we worked the soil with our hands, Chloe chattering about her upcoming role in the theater production of Annie, I felt the last pieces of the old fear fall away. I'd spent so many years of my life seeking approval from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it. I'd tolerated disrespect and cruelty because I believed family was supposed to be forever, that blood ties were sacred, that surely, if I just tried hard enough, I could make them love me. It took nearly losing my daughter for me to understand the truth. Some people are poison, and no amount of hoping or trying or sacrificing will change that. The only thing you can do is remove yourself from their reach and build something better in the space they used to occupy. Our life now isn't perfect. Chloe still has hard days when the effects of her injury frustrate her or when memories surface that trigger anxiety. I still have moments of rage when I think about what Richard and Eleanor did, when I imagine them in their prison cells, and wish their punishment could somehow match the enormity of their crime. Marcus and I have disagreements. Daniel and I still sometimes fall into old patterns of miscommunication, and the nonprofit work is emotionally draining in ways that sometimes leave me depleted. But it's real, it's honest. It's built on genuine love and mutual respect, rather than performance and pretense. And that makes all the difference. Last month, Chloe came home from school with a writing assignment. Her teacher had asked the students to write about their personal hero. I expected her to write about a celebrity or historical figure, but when she showed me the paper, my name was at the top. My hero is my mom. She'd written in her careful, slightly shaky handwriting. She is brave and strong, and she saved me when bad people tried to hurt me. She started a place called Chloe's House that helps other people who need to be saved. She shows me that you can be scared and brave at the same time. She shows me that when people are mean to you, you don't have to be mean back, but you also don't have to let them keep hurting you. My mom is my hero because she loves me no matter what, and she always keeps me safe. I cried when I read it, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond words. All the pain, all the fear, all the impossible choices and sleepless nights and moments when I thought we wouldn't survive, it had all been worth it. Because Chloe was here, she was healing, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was loved and valuable and safe. That's what victory looks like. Not some grand dramatic moment of revenge, though there was satisfaction in seeing Richard and Eleanor face justice. Real victory is in the quiet moments. It's in Chloe's laughter when she's playing with friends. It's in her confidence as she performs on stage. It's in her ability to trust that the adults in her life will protect her rather than harm her. It's in the knowledge that she's growing up understanding her worth instead of spending decades searching for it in all the wrong places. Richard and Eleanor wanted to prune what they saw as weak branches from the family tree. They wanted to eliminate anything that didn't fit their vision of genetic purity and social status. But they failed. Chloe is thriving, living proof that their cruel ideology was bankrupt from the start. The weak branch they tried to destroy is stronger than they ever were precisely because she knows what it means to be truly valued rather than conditionally accepted. So here's what I want you to take away from our story. If you're in a relationship that makes you feel worthless, if someone treats your value as negotiable based on how well you serve their interests, if anyone in your life sees you or your children as obstacles to be managed or eliminated, please hear me. You deserve better. Your children deserve better. And there is life, real beautiful, messy, complicated life, on the other side of the decision to walk away. It won't be easy. The people you leave behind will likely try to punish you for having the audacity to set boundaries. They'll lie about you, try to destroy your reputation, maybe even try to take away the people or things you love. They'll tell you you're being dramatic, that you're the problem, that you're breaking up the family over nothing. Don't listen. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find allies who believe you and will stand with you. Get professional help from therapists and lawyers who understand abuse dynamics. Build your case, protect yourself and your loved ones, and then walk away without looking back. And to those of you who've already walked away, who are in the messy middle of rebuilding your life after escaping toxicity, I see you. I know how hard it is. I know there are days when you question whether you did the right thing, when you feel guilty for choosing yourself over family loyalty, when you're exhausted from the fight and not sure you can keep going. Keep going. The exhaustion is temporary, but what you're building is permanent. Every boundary you set, every time you choose your well-being over someone else's comfort, every day you survive and move forward, you're creating the foundation for a life that belongs to you. It gets easier, the clarity gets sharper, the guilt fades, and eventually you'll find yourself standing in a field planting wildflowers with your child, and you'll realize you're not just surviving anymore, you're actually living. That's our story. From the nightmare of that June night in the Hamptons to the peace of this small Vermont field, we traveled through hell and came out the other side. Scarred, yes. Changed forever, absolutely, but alive and healing and building something beautiful from the ashes of what we escaped. If our story resonates with you, if you've experienced something similar, or you're currently in a toxic situation, wondering if you have the strength to leave, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your story, or just letting me know you're out there fighting your own battle. Hit that like button if this message meant something to you, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories of survival and resilience. And remember, you're not alone. Whatever you're going through, however impossible it seems, there are people who understand and who will stand with you. Reach out. Ask for help. Take the first step, even if it's terrifying. Because you deserve a life where you're valued, where you're safe, where you can plant wildflowers and watch them grow without fear. The monsters don't win unless we let them. And I promise you, on the other side of the fight, there's a life worth living waiting for you to claim it.